So today being the last lecture, the majority of what we're going to talk about is really about the money involved in energy and the costing of energy, pricing of energy, and that leads on to a whole series of environmental and social issues. We'll discuss some of those over explicit energy technologies and also some of the aspects of taxation and subsidies that are absolutely key to driving behavior over how people use and consume energy. And these are the tools that, as you'll see, are absolutely essential if you want to look at climate change agendas and if you want to change how people consume carbon. So what are you going to learn today? Well, we're going to go through and look at energy costs, prices and profits. We're really going to teach you how to cost energy. So this is also very much from the engineering perspective. We're well aware that some people on this course will go and work in industry and build power stations, and being able to understand what the cost of electricity or any form of energy that you're going to use, that's a key part of this course. We'll talk about inflation, discounting, present value and annuitization, and what are the life cycle costs and payback time of the different technologies. We'll give you some examples of how to calculate life cycle of CO2 emitted from generation. This is a very difficult area to do well, as you'll see. And we'll use energy subsidies and discuss those versus energy taxes in driving behavior. And then finally, we'll talk a bit more about environmental costs of energy. Now, there's relatively little from a scientific basis at the moment to actually quantify environmental costs, but at least we'll go through a few of the issues and give you an idea of some of the areas that certainly have to be discussed in the future with climate change. So let's just start with looking at petrol prices in the UK and other countries. So I appreciate this is not every country for the people on this course, but at least what this is trying to show is that if we compare what the real fuel price is in the different countries, compared to what is the price that a consumer will buy petrol at a petrol pump if they go in with their own car, you can see there's vastly different prices in different countries. Now, in fact, the fuel cost is relatively similar in the different countries. It's a little bit higher where consumption is lower, so countries with less people, but generally it's relatively similar. And you can see now that actually the large percentage, certainly in the UK, Denmark and France, of the pump price is actually tax. So that's a decision that's been made by those countries to a very high taxation on petrol. Whilst if you look at the USA price, they actually have a very low tax level put on petrol, or gasoline as they call it. Now, with India and China here, the data that's available doesn't differentiate between what the fuel price and the pump price, but you can get a vague idea looking at the fuel prices from other countries, what percentage of this is going to be in taxation. And you can see in China, the taxes are less than the taxes are likely to be in India. Now, the fuel price here is going to depend on volume, source, supply, but also the refining costs. But the key point of this slide is taxation can make an enormous difference to the real cost of a fuel, whether that's electricity, whether that's a carbon-based fuel, fossil fuel, or any other form of energy. So in many countries, diesel has also been made cheaper to actually encourage people to adopt diesel engines because they're more efficient. In the last number of years, that started to change as people realized that the emissions from diesel are actually much more harmful to humans than petrol. So despite the fact that there's less CO2 come from using diesel engines because of the higher calorific value than petrol by 10%, there are other effects to the environment that come out of diesel actually make them more dangerous to humans. Now we can look at this also with other types of energy sources as well. So in this example, we've included electricity, we've got heating oil in the brown, and we've also got gas. Could people please mute? So for instance, if we look here at electricity, Denmark has an extremely high taxation that is put in electricity. And that has been deliberate to actually subsidize particularly wind farms and to actually move strongly towards renewable energy for their electricity sources. UK also has carbon taxes, and I'll talk about that later in the lecture and give you explicit values. But in fact, in the UK, the taxes on heating oil are actually very low. And that's a social decision, because many of the consumers of heating oil actually live in remote parts of the UK, predominantly remote parts of Scotland. And there, electricity isn't always the easiest to get to. It's also very expensive. So it's actually a decision that's been made to make sure that those communities don't get into fuel poverty simply by trying to heat their homes. Now, gas and heating oil are always cheaper than electricity. And this comes back to the argument we made in earlier lectures about the quality of the energy. So electricity, as you'll see in the next couple of slides as well, is always much higher. Now, this is not the costs that consumers would have if we ended up pricing by the CO2 that was emitted by the different sources. And if we did that, we'd end up with very different costs. So these are all historical costs from 2009, and it at least sets a point before many of the new changes that are starting to happen in different countries for climate change have been implemented. So let's also look at industrial energy costs. So typically industry will actually use more energy. Because they're a higher volume customer, they can get cheaper prices. And again, if you look at the prices here, electricity is still always the highest. And depending on the types of fuel oils, gas or coal, you can see here in the UK, coal, and in fact, this is still the case, coal is the cheapest fuel you can still buy. Now, again, this slide has nothing over bringing in carbon emissions and CO2 emissions. And as we've seen in earlier lectures, coal is by far the worst polluting of all the fuels that are around. And you can now see part of the issues that many countries have on this. If you want to have the lowest prices for fuel and for electricity, then coal is by far the best to have. Sorry, I'm just going to try and mute everybody. Sorry about this. Okay, so it looks like the university has changed the setup of Zoom. Apologies for this. Right, let's keep going. But if people could mute the microphones, it would be greatly appreciated. Oops. Right. So, as you can see here, there's a whole series of issues that you have to take into account when you start to consider how a population is going to use energy. And the price of that energy is really a key factor. Now, the UK has been quite strange when we look at these numbers. you can start to see some falls. And in fact, the UK deregularised and denationalised a lot of the energy sectors in the 2000s. And so what you're starting to see towards the end of these graphs, at the end of the first decade of 2000, is we're starting to see some falls, but also some variation that is due to market competition. But more generally, what we want to look at is inflation in the retail price index. So over a period of time, prices typically increase. And this is going to become key when we start looking at how to cost energy and how we can actually build power stations and provide the money to build power stations. So on the left graph here, we have the retail price index, and that's the number represented, the price of a typical basket of household goods and mortgages at a fixed point in time. So each country will have a retail price index. It's the rate of change of that that actually determines inflation. And it's a typical basket, or if you like it, it's the cost of living. So that's going to include rental prices for properties. It's going to include fuel prices. It's going to include the cost of buying a house and mortgages and interest rates and that, but also food and general things that people will consume on a daily basis throughout a year. Now, different countries choose different things that go in that basket, so to speak, but generally you can see with every country that over a period of time, the retail price index rises, things become more expensive, and the relative change of that can change quite substantially over time. So I'll give more up-to-date values in the UK in a minute, but you can see the UK had an economic crisis in 1975, and the inflation rate increased quite significantly up to about 24%. If we look much more recently, over about the last 10 years, the interest rate or inflation in the UK has actually been extremely low and typically around a 2% mark. So in fact, the last data in this goes up to January a year ago. And you can see, in fact, at that point in time, it was about 1.7% was the UK inflation rate. And this graph actually also breaks it down into the different constituent components. So you can see this light blue is the cost of housing and household services. We've got transport in yellow. Recreation comes in. There's alcohol and tobacco. Blue, food, you can see is quite a substantial amount in here. There's clothing and footwear, restaurants, hotels, other goods and services. So typically when we look at this, it's the cost of renting or buying a house is the largest, certainly in the UK, when we look at inflation. Now, over time, relative costs of energy can change quite substantially. And the relative costs are heavily dependent on inflation. Now, this particular graph, what it's trying to do is normalize out to 2010 earnings so that all the prices for previous years are about the same. And you can see the variance that is going on because of the markets and supply and demand for different fuels. Now, students typically are surprised by electricity and how much electricity early on was very expensive. You have to remember that the first electricity distributions only really started in the 1920s in the UK. And so electricity was a relatively new form of energy, and coal, which is the solid fuel in black here, gas, heating oil, were much more prevalent from the Victorian era through. And this cost is really because it was a new technology and expensive when you first got it. But overall, you can see what I was talking about earlier, that electricity generally is much more expensive than particularly all these fossil fuels. Now, fuel poverty has been something that in the UK, it's been discussed much more in recent times. And this is old data that you see there. If I update it, you can see, in fact, fuel poverty has been rising quite substantially throughout the last decade in the UK. And in fact, the last available data, there's always a bit of time lag in the fuel poverty data. You can see that since about 2013, it's been above 10%. And fuel poverty here is the average UK percentage household expenditure just in fuel. So when it gets above 10%, then that's considered to be many people are in fuel poverty. So this is a significant social issue in the UK. And the UK is a relatively wealthy country. There are many other countries where fuel poverty is a much bigger issue. So as you'll see as we go through today, fossil fuels are cheap. From a climate change position, it's very easy to say tax fossil fuels. But what this slide and the data here is showing, that has significant social issues in many countries. So when you're looking at ways of dealing with climate change, turning to renewables and to getting rid of fossil fuels are typically much more expensive than using fossil fuels. So moving over to these things has a significant potential for social injustice and putting many more people into fuel poverty in the future. And that's something that needs to be tackled when you start to consider in your own countries how to move to lower carbon sources of energy. Right, so what we're going to do now is really go through some basic economics. So apologies to those that have done accountancy or basic economics, but this really, as you'll see, becomes very important to understand what the real costs of energy are. So we need to start by looking at a financial investment. Now, what we'll talk about through today is the building of a power station. Now, that could be nuclear, that could be gas, could be coal, could be hydro, could be wind turbines and wind farms, many different forms of power stations. So for a financial investment and to work out whether you're going to build a power station or not, we're talking about putting money into a project with the expectation of a profit based on analysis. Now, profit is absolutely key in a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. Profit is what pays the taxes that certainly in the UK allows education. That's what pays my salary to be able to teach all the people on this lecture. It's what pays for the hospitals. It's what pays for the roads, the transportation systems, and so on. So profit is not necessarily something that is bad. It has to be there in parts of the economy to pay the taxes that pay for many parts of society. So price. We're going to be very explicit about price and cost and the economic difference. Price is determined by the marketplace. This is what you can sell electricity or fuel at. Cost is the minimum amount for which the producer must sell the energy in order for its production to make a profit or at least break even. So in economics, the price is the cost plus a profit. So we're differentiating in society, in the media, and many people intermix price and cost. When you're actually looking at economics and businesses, cost is basically how much it is the amount of money to actually produce something. Price is what you sell it at, and the difference between the two is the profit. Now, as you can see here, if the price you sell it at is greater than the cost of making it, then you'll end up with, if the price is less than the cost of making it, you end up with a negative profit and you make a loss. So what are the costs of a project? Remember that financial investment we've defined as putting money into this project with the expectation of making a profit. And whether we do that is going to be based on financial analysis. This analysis, well, the life cycle costs, that's the whole life cost of the project. So that's the total cost of ownership over the complete life of the asset we're talking about. So that asset, typically today, will be a power station. Now, we've said life cycle costs. Life cycle costs, typically we think of money, so monetary. They can also be energy-wise, but much more now with climate change agendas, they can all be carbon-based. And in the first lecture and throughout the course, we've been talking about the CO2 that gets emitted directly from burning fuels, particularly fossil fuels. But we've also spoken about the life cycle carbon that comes from building power stations, as well as maintenance and other ways that we emit carbon in producing energy. Now, the other things we need to talk about, and we'll go through today as well, we have a payback time, and that's defined as the period of time required for the investment to be repaid. So what we'll look at, and we'll go through a number of examples later today, is we'll work out how much money we have to borrow to be able to build a power station and how long it takes for us selling the energy at a particular price before we pay back the investment for building that power station. We're also, towards the end, going to talk about tax breaks and subsidies, and these are political mechanisms to encourage financial investment where the market price is too high. So you'll see today that certainly when we look at the UK tax breaks, subsidies, typically the UK is taxing fossil fuels and fuels that emit carbon and providing subsidies to renewable energy, which, as you can probably work out, the requirement of subsidies mean that they are more expensive than burning fossil fuels to get the equivalent electricity or other forms of energy. So that's the first bit for today. Does anybody have any questions? Let me stop the recording.